Well, as we just previously heard, there's a lot of jobs in tech, and cybersecurity is probably the area that has the most open jobs today. In fact, today there's over 2 million open positions in cyber that are unfilled because there's not skilled enough people to fill them. That's estimated to go through 3.5 million, according to Gartner, by 2020. So one of the things that we look at is how can we actually augment our human security teams? And how can we also help new people who are entering this area to actually fill that skill gap, bring up their skill by learning from artificial intelligence? What this sets up is something that we call the machine fights back. The idea that our corporate networks are actually now the target of nation-state level attacks. So let's talk about some of these attacks that we're seeing. So obviously, we hear of the global ones like WannaCry, ransomware that moves so fast that it's hard for human teams to possibly keep up. So what can we do about things like ransomware? Well, what if the ransomware hits at 2 a.m. and you don't have 24/7 security coverage? What if the machine learning could detect that ransomware in mere seconds and stop it? Or at a minimum, slow it down until your human team can catch up and maybe deal with it at 9 in the morning. Now let's talk about insider threat. I think insider threat is a still area in security that's not talked about enough. One of the reasons that insider threat is so difficult to deal with is we all want to have full trust in our employees. But at the same time, with insider threat, it can start very non-malicious and become more malicious over time. There we go. Maybe to start with, for example, we had an insider threat that we detected using Darktrace where at first the employee was a happy, good employee going about their job. Next thing, they discovered that they could find the backup email server. They then noticed that they could start reading the CEO's emails. So there's an example where it started quite innocently but could become malicious over time. Now let's talk about trust attacks. With trust attacks, we saw what happened with the Democratic national election in the United States, and now we're seeing that this is becoming a concern on a global basis. But trust attacks don't have to be only against democracy. Trust attacks can also be aimed at executives in corporations or corporations themselves. The things with trust attacks is they're very targeted, they're very one-off attacks. They're usually engineered by human, very skilled attackers. They're also very silent and subtle to find within the network. But there's a new emerging type of attack that we haven't really seen yet, and that is an attack that uses artificial intelligence. We've been talking about how attacks can be stopped with artificial intelligence, but what happens if the attack actually starts using artificial intelligence? Imagine something that can move as quickly as ransomware, but actually uses AI. So it can go inside the network and learn what your defenses are and figure out how to work around those. So how do we deal with this? Well, the good news is that the human body has been fighting attacks for millions of years. So what if we looked to the human body as a way of inspiration? Now, the way the human immune system works is it's complex, but it has an innate sense of self. It then automatically detects what's not self. And that's exactly how artificial intelligence can help us detect threats. So by putting artificial intelligence inside the core of a network, we can analyze 100% of raw network traffic, and we can automatically figure out what's normal and what's unusual. And then by using very advanced types of mathematical approaches, we can connect the dots. We can figure out if there's multiple items going on at the same time that are unusual, that may increase the probability that the network is coming under attack. And we can use that for early threat detection. And that's the first stage, is how do you actually use AI to detect the threats itself? The next part is actually, how can you use the artificial intelligence to respond to the attack? So this takes it a step further, no longer relying on humans to detect the attack, but now actually using the AI to investigate it. Now, the reason this is difficult is it's not only about historical attacks. In fact, the reason we keep seeing networks being attacked is the old legacy methods are no longer working. They rely on what's called rules and signatures. So if you write a rule, you'd have to think about every possible attack vector that the very creative attackers could come up with. And there's no way to think about all those different possibilities. Now, if you use signatures, that means you're analyzing historical attack data to predict future attacks. But the reality is, as we've seen, historical attacks are not necessarily an indicator of future attacks. In fact, they don't tend to be much of a predictor at all. So with this new emerging area, we call it autonomous response. It would be using artificial intelligence to automatically slow down, take action, or stop attacks. Now, this is brand new technology. We actually have the only autonomous response technology on the market today. And one thing that we learned is that we have to, similar to other types of AI applications, we have to figure out how to build trust between the human security teams and the artificial intelligence. So let me give you a couple examples. We deployed this inside a hedge fund, and the hedge fund said, we're short-staffed, we outsource a lot of our IT, we don't have dedicated security people, so we love this idea of using artificial intelligence to help us out. But we can't afford to ever allow artificial intelligence to slow down or stop a trade. So how do we combine these two together? So one of the things we can do is deploy it in what we call recommendation mode, and just start watching what recommendations the artificial intelligence would take and when it would take it. The next thing we created was a feature called human confirmation mode. What if you actually gave the human a chance to look at visually which actions the AI wanted to take and allow a human to actually confirm it, maybe even on a mobile phone, to actually ensure that the right action is being taken at the right time. And then over time, what we found is when the AI keeps taking the right action over and over again, the human trusts it and puts it in what we call active mode. So that's some of the lessons that we've learned by deploying this autonomous response, that trust relationship of making sure that AI is making the right choices at the right time and allowing humans to have some input and control to that becomes really important. So that takes us a little bit more into machine learning. Now, we found that it's not good to necessarily have purists when it comes to machine learning. And what I mean by that is there's usually different approaches to machine learning and deep learning you can take to solve different parts of the problem. So let's start by unsupervised machine learning. Now, unsupervised machine learning, kind of think of it as on-the-job training. You're not pre-coding anything, you're not feeding it historical. You're allowing it to learn in real time on the job. That's a very unusual technique, but that's actually the technique we used. And one of the reasons we started with that technique is when we entered this market in 2013, there was no historical data set that we thought made sense. If we analyzed historical attacks, it would be no better than the signature-based technologies that were already failing. So what we did instead is say, what if we could install this machine learning in any network in less than an hour? What if we came back a week later and can actually show a company the threats that had been undetected that were already inside their system? And that's exactly what we do with unsupervised machine learning. Now, fast forward, we've been doing this for 4 years. We've deployed in over 4,000 networks. Now we've built up a really interesting data set that everyone can leverage. And remember, no two networks are alike. So this has to work in cloud. This has to work in virtualized. It has to work across all different types of legacy devices. For instance, legacy devices that might be in industrial control systems like energy plants that might have equipment from the 60s and 70s in it, together with new types of technologies like Internet of Things devices. It needs to work across all that. But in addition to the unsupervised machine learning, there's also supervised. Now, we found a very different use case for supervised machine learning, and that use case is we use it to actually analyze and watch human threat analysts. So we have a team of 80 threat analysts. Many of them came from places like the British intelligence, GCHQ and MI5, or US intelligence like the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. And what we did was we actually watched how these people at the top of their game, investigated and remediated threats inside of networks. We took that know-how and we packaged it into algorithms and added that into the product. So now you have all the advantages of understanding from an artificial intelligence perspective how experienced threat analysts can help investigate and respond to these threats. Finally, you have deep learning. We also use some deep learning techniques. And these become systems where the threat identification starts interacting with the threat response. So for example, the threat response systems might say, you know what? I think this threat looks interesting, but I'm not quite sure yet if I need to take action on it. Can you go back and watch it a little bit longer? And then I'll decide if I have enough information to take action. Because remember, some of these attacks are what's called low and slow. They can stay in networks for months, if not years. So you need to have the ability to have the AI keep working with the attack and learning from it. And that's where the deep learning techniques come in. So when we talk about machine learning, it is all about the data. And in our case, that data is real-time network traffic. Now, there have been solutions out there based on what's called Netflow. Netflow looks at 20 to 30 data features. The problem with that is most of the attackers know the 20 to 30 data features Netflow's looking at. But in addition to that, it's really not enough data features to be able to find these unknown attacks, these very creative, silent, subtle attacks. So we actually analyze up to 400 simultaneous data features. And data features really do make a difference in terms of being able to find things like configuration errors, human error, insider threat, or nation-state level attacks. So it's a big difference between the simple data feature analysis to the advanced. Now, I know some people also say, well, what about other data sources? What about third-party threat intelligence feeds? What about endpoint as another data set? What about log files that you might have in your Splunk systems? So we also can correlate all of those other types of data types together with the network traffic to get even a higher probability of answer whether there's an attack. In fact, we can also combine it with things like physical security systems. We've combined this data with things like biometric scanners, or maybe simple card swipe systems to see was that employee actually in that building at the time this cyber attack happened, or was it someone on the outside who stole their credentials? So there's lots of interesting ways that you can combine the data. I'm going to give a quick example. And this one is a Raspberry Pi. So this was in a digital media company, and someone had designed a digital media application, and they wanted to actually see how this looks. So they wanted to take this digital media application from their iPhone and project it on a screen. Really simplistic use case, nothing wrong with it. But Darktrace detected it as being unusual because no one else had plugged a Raspberry Pi into this particular part of the network. So at first the security team said, well, why do I care? So what? This person was doing nothing wrong. They plugged the Raspberry Pi in. It's normal for them to be able to do this. Nothing that's a security problem. Well, actually it was. They failed to change the password on the Raspberry Pi. So if someone scanned that network looking for IoT devices or connected devices, they immediately could have found this and used this as a way to jump on to the rest of the network and maybe find something of interest. But there was another Raspberry Pi device example that I think was even more compelling. And that was, we detected 2 Raspberry Pis looked like they were connecting to data center machines. So we brought this to the attention of this very skilled security team and a very highly protected data center. And they said, there's absolutely no way that these devices are in our data center. We would know about it. So after this went back and forth for about 2 weeks, we actually designed a geospatial location system, and we located the Raspberry Pi devices. They were planted under the floorboards in the data center. And after we were nicely ushered out of the data center, the FBI, because this was a US customer, was ushered in. And it turns out that an employee who had access to the data center had been bribed by someone outside to plant these devices in the data center floorboards to slowly siphon out data over time. Another interesting example using an IoT device, a bit more unusual, this was a fish tank that was actually deployed in a casino. Now, I couldn't quite figure out why an IoT connected fish tank existed. I guess I don't know enough about fish. But supposedly, it was to do everything to monitor the thermostat to make sure the temperature stayed at the right levels, monitor chemical levels in the water. So there were valid reasons. However, from this IoT connected fish tank, again, you could break into this easily. There was no security on it. Laterally move into the casino's network and start searching for the high rollers database. And that's exactly what this attacker did. Once they located the high roller database, they started trying to move it across the network to upload it to a cloud. And of course, Darktrace was able to detect this because we're like, why is the fish tank searching laterally across the network for a high rollers database? So again, something that you don't know to write a rule for. Another interesting one has been Bitcoin mining. We've actually detected in the last 6 months alone 995 cases where companies didn't realize that someone had come in and taken over their infrastructure to manufacture Bitcoins. Now, in some cases, this was an outside attacker breaking in. In other cases, it turned out it was actually someone who was a system administrator, someone who had privileged access rights, who decided to make a little money on the side by getting in the Bitcoin manufacturing market. Now here's another one. This was actually a ransomware where a receptionist had clicked on a file. The ransomware started moving through the network very quickly. It was actually moving at a speed that would have encrypted 200 files per minute. Darktrace was able to detect this right away and stop it in less than 30 seconds. So yes, 100 files ended up being encrypted, but this would have been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of files that could have been encrypted, similar to what we saw spread around the world with WannaCry. In fact, Darktrace's customers were all protected by WannaCry with our autonomous response. And then finally, this was an interesting one. This was actually, in certain industries, you'll see people switch from one competitor to another. And this one happened to be a hotel chain. And the employee actually had access to the cloud. And what they did is they took their credentials with them across the street to the other hotel, and they re-logged in. It turned out their access rights had never been turned off by the first employer. Interestingly, we were able to detect this because when they went to log in, they logged in from a different device that those credentials had never been used from before, and we were able to quickly flag it. But IoT devices is probably the biggest takeaway, I'd say, that we are seeing connected devices across all different industries walk into networks, and no one's going to the IT team or the security team to bring this to their attention. And they're seldom protected, and there's good reason for that. There's a lot of manufacturers trying to get these products to market as fast as possible, or maybe they control some level of security, but the reality is it's all about the connectivity of the network that is where the damage will be done. And with connected devices, you've got cloud providers, you've got Wi-Fi providers, you have the device manufacturer, and you have the consumer who might forget to change the password. So you have a lot of different issues in there. So please make sure you're protecting for your connected devices. So with that, I'd like to just show a very short video of what this looks like inside your network. So I mentioned this whole area of autonomous response. And here we have a network, and we're monitoring actively 30,000 connected devices. Even given all those devices, there's only a handful of anomalies we see at the bottom. We click on one of those, and we go in and we see that this is actually a laptop. And we can actually see who the laptop is registered to. And this brings up a log file. This will give us a step-by-step of everything that that laptop is doing at the time in question. But I think there's a better way to maybe visualize this than even the log file. And that would be, what if we could actually show it visually? What if you could actually see the inside of your network and what was happening to that device at that time? So what you see here with the blue lines is actually the movement of files, the movement of traffic. And we can see the volumes of traffic, and we can see when there's spikes in that performance. But let's go back and watch this traffic a little bit longer. And while the traffic is actually behaving normally, the artificial intelligence doesn't do anything. In fact, it's there to leave it alone, to do what we call enforce the natural or normal pattern of life. But what happens if all of a sudden this laptop that only connects to this one domain controller, what if it starts doing something unusual it's never done before? What would happen then, and how would the artificial intelligence spot it? And that's exactly what we're going to see happen here in this network traffic playback. All of a sudden, see all those bright lights. It connected to a second server it wasn't supposed to be. It's moving all that data. Now it turns green. That means Antigena, the artificial intelligence, recognized this new pattern and stopped the attack in its tracks. And that's the power of autonomous response, or what we call the machine fights back. Thank you very much.